Hello, and welcome to this live re-recording of our earlier webinar. We are re-recording due to technical issues. My name is Vinesh Chetty, and I'm the head of research here at Afriforesight. I will be joined by my colleague, Devin Allers. Unfortunately, our chief economist, Nathan Musson, is unable to meet with us, but we will still cover all commodities. For those who are new to Afriforesight, we are the largest forecasting house in Africa focused on commodities. We forecast the prices of mined and extracted commodities, as well as prices of input costs for mining and processing, as well as labor, and critically important for today, transport costs. If you would like to subscribe, or if you have any questions about your subscription and would like to add to it, please contact Sebastian or Murali at the email addresses on screen. We'll start off today with a global growth outlook. I'll then cover container shipping, followed by the port backlogs at Southern African ports. I'll then hand over to Devin to take us through iron ore, manganese, and chrome, before rounding us off with coal. The world economy is forecast to grow in 2024, and I think that's very important because despite all the problems, Afriforesight is not calling for a recession in 2024. We're seeing the world growing. It is slower growth than we saw in 2022 or 2023, but the world is still growing. Now, despite all the problems we're seeing, particularly with high inflation, high interest rates, Europe's energy problems, and China growing slower than expected, China is still growing, and the US economy is still ticking on. And despite the supply chain problems, we think that they will get fixed up, and there's still lots of investment in the green transition. So that should help the world economy grow in 2024 and to pick up going forward. As for what is driving shipping costs higher, I'd like to point out that oil through shipping fuels is not a significant contributor at the moment. As you see on screen, shipping fuel costs have been broadly unchanged over the last year or so. When we look at the shipping market, there are two big areas: container shipping, which you see container shipping rates on screen now, and bulk shipping, which we'll get to a little bit later. Containers tend to be used mainly for consumer products, such as bicycles and TVs, but it can also be used for certain commodities, particularly chrome, which we'll cover a little bit later. What you see with the rates on screen right now is the cost of shipping a 40-foot equivalent container from Asia, where most manufacturing takes place, to the US West Coast in red, and to Europe in blue. And you see that particularly towards the end of 2023 and into the start of 2024, we saw a sharp rise in the cost of shipping. Now, for the shipping to Europe, there was a particular issue to do with the Suez Canal. With the war in the Middle East, we saw that spill over with Yemeni rebel groups attacking Western ships. And because of that, many ship owners diverted their ships around Africa. So that particularly adds time and thus costs to shipping to Europe. But nothing happens in a vacuum. So because of those increased costs of shipping to Europe, and because of ships taking more days to get to Europe, that's days that ship isn't available to ship on another route, it also pushed up on the cost of shipping to the US. Now, what does this mean for South and Southern Africa? Well, we have significant port backlogs. There was quite a lot of media attention around the port of Durban, but we're covering these 6 major port and port groupings. And what you see here in these blue bars each month is the monthly average of the number of ships waiting outside of these ports. So that shows you how backlogged a port is. The taller the bar is, the more ships there are waiting to enter those ports. And as I said, there was a lot of media coverage, particularly around Durban, with those helicopter shots of 80 or so ships waiting on certain days outside of Durban. Now, when we look at these ports, it's worth noting that there are different commodities and different products which flow through these different ports. Durban and Cape Town tend to be container ports, so tend to bring those consumer goods through them, whereas Saldanha Bay tends to be an iron ore export port. Port Elizabeth and Coega, 2 ports that are very close to each other in the Eastern Cape. This is the main export route for manganese, which Devin will talk a bit more about later. And then Richards Bay in KwaZulu-Natal and Maputo and Matola, which are next to each other in Mozambique, are the main export gateways for South Africa's coal as well as chrome. So different commodities through different ports. But as I said, Durban had a big backlog, and we've seen South African ports are generally backlogged because of issues with Transnet port handling. We've seen equipment problems as well as staffing issues. But to Transnet's credit, they told us back in November that they were working to remove or ease the backlog, particularly with Durban's container terminals by February. And you do see that from November into February, there was a decrease in that backlog. So they have improved that over there. But some issues have crept in. So now with the avoidance of the Suez Canal, we've seen an uptick here. And also when you clear or when there's a problem at one port, it can have knock-on effects to other ports, even outside of South Africa. So when we look at that, when Richards Bay was backlogged, we saw South African exporters looking to the close-by ports of Maputo and Matola, and they now have problems because, again, things don't happen in a vacuum. When there's a problem in one area, it can lead to knock-on effects elsewhere. Also, Transnet focusing its efforts around Durban, we have seen backlogs building at places like Saldanha. We have seen a general uptick across PE and Kucha, and Cape Town as well, broadly worse now than it was last year. So, as I said, some of those problems were Transnet equipment and staffing issues, but we've also seen the Suez Canal issue. As ships are moving around Africa instead of through the Suez Canal, that can add to backlogs at South African ports. Now, how does that happen? Well, even if a ship which is sailing from Asia and sailing around Africa to Europe, even if those ships are not offloading cargo or loading cargo through Southern African ports, they might refuel around Southern Africa because of the longer journey time, burning more fuel going from Asia to Europe. They also might stop at Southern African ports to change out crews. Now, South African ports in particular were not the fastest at refueling. And as we have more ships coming around, more ships demanding fuel, that problem gets backed up. Now, again, what causes backups? It's like a traffic jam, similar to with cars. When you have more ships arriving, then you can turn around, the backlog builds up. And if you can move more ships out than you have arriving, that helps to clear the backlog. So how did we start to clear backlogs around places like Durban? We move more ships out faster than they are arriving, and we refuel ships that want fuel faster than they are arriving. So that's how we help to ease the problem. But the problem is significant, and it hurts South African competitiveness because when there is a backlog, we tend to see cargoes being moved elsewhere, and they tend to be higher costs because even when ships are idling, even when they're standing around, that means that ship is not doing something else. And that means that the ship owners, the ship charterers, pass those costs on through surcharges and additional fees. So again, that hurts the South African consumer and it hurts South Africa as a whole through our weakened competitiveness. So we need to see South African ports work more efficiently, more efficient throughput, more efficient use of equipment, and more efficient refueling. But this can have a significant impact on specific South African commodity exports. And to look at some of those, I'll hand you over to Devin.
Thanks, Vinesh, and good morning. Yes, so I'll be giving a brief overview of South Africa's iron, manganese, and chrome ore markets with some emphasis on your port and rail issues, some of the recent developments, and also future expansion plans. But before I jump into the commodities themselves, just want to provide a bit of context. So when taking a look at the leading producers of your crude steel, and which typically requires your iron ore and manganese as input materials, and your stainless steel major producers, which requires ferrochrome, which is produced using your chrome ore. China is the dominant player in the market, and therefore drives demand for these raw materials. So this is a figure of China's annual import trends for iron ore, manganese, and chrome. In 2023, we did see a strong recovery in import volumes for each of the commodities as China's industrial activity picked up after they eased their 2022 zero COVID policy. This is a positive for South Africa, with China being our biggest buyer of these commodities. On the supply side, South Africa is the largest producer of your chrome and manganese ore. As seen at the bottom two pie charts on the slide. But for iron ore production, South Africa is a relatively small player. Um, so any constraints to logistics infrastructure tend to have a global impact on the manganese and chrome ore markets, while the impact on the iron ore market is mostly felt domestically. So in terms of South Africa's annual export volumes, we did see a strong recovery in, or we did see a recovery in exports for all three commodities in 2023, with that recovery in demand that we saw from China. But logistics issues continue to impact domestic mining activity, where South Africa's 2023 iron ore exports are still far lower than pre-COVID levels, which leads me into a more sector-specific discussion. So on this slide, um, so this is a figure of South Africa's iron ore annual exports by port, showing that export volumes have remained relatively stable over the last decade, currently being held back by these logistics constraints. Um, and we can see that the iron ore terminal at Saldanha Bay is the main export terminal um, for iron ore exports, where Anglo America is the line's largest customer, where just last year they were forced to cut their production due to excessive stockpiling at their mines, due to some rail and port inefficiencies, including equipment failures at the Saldanha Bay port, which stopped them from getting some of their products out into the market. So now Kumba is now expected to maintain their production at around the 36 million ton per annum mark until the end of 2026. This is in line with some of Transnet's plans to increase the capacity of the Sishin Saldanha railway line, as well as the Saldanha port, from the 60 million tons per annum to 67 million tons per annum by the end of 2028, where they're also considering further expansions to 77 million tons. So similarly, we've seen the impact with another South African producer, African Rainbow Minerals, where they also failed to meet their production guidance for last year, and have actually reduced their production guidance for this year as well. But there's also been some port and rail service issues at ArcelorMittal, South Africa's steel operations, where towards the end of last year, ArcelorMittal had announced consultations with shareholders as they considered winding down their long steel operations. A part of this issue was due to a lack of raw material supply. However, news at the beginning of this year did, did show positive discussions and short-term commitments by both government and Transnet to improve the port and rail services, which could sustain operations into the second half of this year. So moving on to manganese, there is a bit of a more positive story for manganese exports, where we have seen a gradual rise in volumes coming out of South Africa. Recent efforts by Transnet to improve and expand the port and rail infrastructure for manganese did support growth again in 2023. But since 2022, Transnet increased the capacity of the manganese line um, um, from Hotel to Port Elizabeth, after completing construction of two substations on the line, supporting additional volumes. But more significantly, last year, in 2023, Transnet actually doubled the manganese export allocation for emerging miners. But this in itself presented some risk of increased trucking costs and constraining some supply growth from your major producers, where eventually Transnet had signed an agreement with Kalahari to convert one of their rapid loading facilities into a common loading facility, which can be used by these emerging miners, mitigating some of the risk. But then again, there was the completion of the Mamatone crossing loop extension in the Northern Cape, which was quite a timely completion by Transnet, which added an additional 1.5 million tons to South Africa's annual export capacity. So just to touch on some of Transnet's expansion plans, Transnet is still progressing with the capacity expansion at the Saldanha Bay, which did also support additional volumes last year. But major improvements are expected in the long term with Transnet's plans to relocate the Port Elizabeth Manganese Ore export terminal to Coega by the end of 2027, where they're expecting production to start in 2026. For South African chrome ore exports, there was also growth in SA's chrome exports, where we did see where we saw increased volumes throh Commodities for export via Maputo. In April last year, Transnet had actually signed an agreement with Mozambique's port authorities to allow trains to operate seamlessly across the border, operating 3 trains a day and improving some train cycle times. To aid this, Transnet also plans to increase the rail capacity to Maputo port, which should further support these improvements. Over the longer term, we should continue seeing growth in exports of South African chrome ore via Maputo. Just at the beginning of this year, Mozambique had approved the $2 billion plan to upgrade and expand the Maputo ports, particularly to cater for SA exports. So although most of the chrome ore export growth came from support from Mozambique, Transnet does plan to improve some of the domestic capacity and phase in expansions at your Richards Bay port. But the expansion timeline will be based on miner demand, which could be delayed due to this increased uptake from Mozambique. But Richards Bay is also a main export terminal for coal. So with that, I'll hand over to Vinesh to discuss more specifics.
So yes, Richards Bay is the major export port for South African coal. But to give some context to where South Africa sits in the coal space, I like to point out that while thermal coal is a significant part of South Africa's export mineral revenue, on the global scale, we are not the biggest player. So unlike chrome ore and manganese ore, where South Africa is the largest exporter, when it comes to thermal coal, South Africa is only in 4th place at 7% of global thermal coal exports. Now, why is this important? Well, the big thing here is that when South Africa has problems, rail issues, port issues, it means that South Africa can lose market share to bigger players like Indonesia and Australia. So coal, which is a bulk commodity, which is shipped in bulk ships, when Transnet can't get enough rail volume from Mpumalanga down to Richards Bay, when we can't get enough coal onto ships because ships can't get in and out fast enough, that effectively signals to big buyers in the world to buy instead from places like Indonesia and Australia. And Indonesia in particular has a big shipping advantage because it is so close to major markets like India, which also is South Africa's largest market. So while coal is very important to the South African export economy, on the global scale, we are relatively small and we are at risk of having our market share taken by countries like Indonesia and Australia. Now, when we look at where South Africa sells its coal to, India is the single largest export customer for South African coal. And those of you who followed coal over a long time would know that there were times where India took almost half the South African exports. But the other big market for South African coal is Europe, shown here in purple. And that includes the EU as well as the UK and other Western European countries. And as a whole, Europe is currently the 2nd largest buyer of South African coal on the export market behind India. Now, when it comes to South African coal exports, there has generally been a decline. You see here from about 2018, we reach a peak, and then we've generally been declining month after month. Now, again, Unfortunately, these are to do with Transnet issues, mainly rail problems, but also to do with port issues. And when South Africa is not exporting to these regions, particularly in India, it allows more Indonesian coal, which can be cheaper or more cost-effective when it lands in India, as well as encourages other miners like Australia to ship to India and encourages more domestic production inside of India. So again, if South Africa was able to get its capacity up, South Africa would probably export more coal. And as we'll see when we get to prices, that can be done profitably. So again, for South Africa's coal exports, the two main markets are India and Europe. Now, how does this bring us back to shipping? Well, what we have on screen now is the cost of shipping a ton of coal from South Africa to India in orange, and the cost of shipping a ton of coal from South Africa to Europe in purple. Now, things to note here is that over the last year or so, costs have generally increased. Costs of shipping to India are higher than costs of shipping to Europe, and costs of shipping to India have risen rapidly. Now, what does this mean? Well, it hurts South African competitiveness because as buyers in India look at things, they want the most cost-effective coal that is arriving on their shores. So when South African shipping costs are high, but Indonesian shipping costs are low, that creates an advantage for Indonesia. Also, these high shipping costs can put downward pressure on the Richards Bay price, the price leaving Richards Bay, because South African coal sellers may have to offer discounts on their coal leaving Richards Bay to account for these high shipping costs when coal lands in India, and similarly in Europe. So again, these high costs hurt South African competitiveness, and right now South African coal is also being held back in terms of volume by the rail and port capacities. In terms of what this means for prices, what we have on screen here is Afriforesight's forecast of two different grades of coal. In the green bars, you see the RB1 spec coal. That is the South African export benchmark. You may know that as the API4 price. It is the price of thermal coal with 6,000 kilocalories of energy content per kilogram. That's the export benchmark. This coal is preferred in places like Europe and Japan. That's the benchmark. Whereas in blue, you see the price of RB3 coal. That's a slightly lower grade coal, 5,500 kilocalories per kilogram energy content. This coal is still as a large export market, and this kind of coal does very well in the Indian market. So these prices tend to rise and fall together, sell for more, but they are affected by the factors that drive thermal coal. And our forecast going forward is that prices do decline, but it's worth noting that currently and in our forecast, we project that coal mining will remain profitable. From current levels, if you look at company reports, there is still money being made. And from our modeling on costs, we see that currently and going forward, we still see profits made on coal mining. But there is a decline in prices as buyers move to cleaner energy, particularly natural gas and renewables. But these prices are being propped up by demand rising in places like India and Southeast Asia for electricity and industrial purposes. And the lack of investment in new mines is also propping up prices. So again, from what we see, it is profitable to mine coal if you currently have a coal mine, but we do see that producers are being held back. We've seen Thungela and Exxaro reduce production mainly on port and rail capacities. But overall, coal mining is still profitable. So those are the formal slides, but we'll get into questions and answers. But to wrap up, before we take questions and answers, overall port backlogs are still a major problem in Southern Africa, and this hurts South African competitiveness and can put downward pressure on selling prices for South African goods because buyers ultimately want landed prices in their regions, and it can also hurt the consumer through higher costs of bringing goods into the country. So we'll now move on to questions and answers, and I see there are already quite a few questions listed. So if I start us out, I see the first question is around the chart we showed with the ports. So once again, what we have on screen here, around does the backlog that we show include just RBCT? Sorry, is it just RBCT or does it include Richards Bay? So it includes RBCT. For all of our ports as well, we're including the entire port. So all terminals, all piers, those numbers are across the board. I also do see we had a hand up. If you could please type your question in the chat, we'll get your question. But for the backlogs, for all the ports, it includes terminals like RBCT as well as any other piers or terminals. Right, then I see a question around Russia's share of coal and how has this been affected by sanctions. So Russia's ability to export coal to Western Europe has been cut off. The EU has said no Russian coal to come in, and we've seen Western Europe, the EU, the UK move away from that. But Russia is still exporting coal, mainly to places like India and China. That's really where there's a market for their coal. So volumes out of Russia have declined because their big customers in Europe no longer want their coal. But Russia can still supply to places like China and India, which are not following G7 Western sanctions on Russia. Okay. Then I see a question here on manganese. Devin, a question around South African grades. What sort of grade do we generally see for South African manganese?
So typically, South Africa has around your 37% grade, your standard benchmark grade, slightly lower than some of your other African countries like Gabon. But it is around 37 million tons, 37% manganese content, specifically used for your steel production. Yeah.
No, that's all good. And yes, just to clarify, that 37% is the price that is generally quoted, including by Afriforesight. So yeah, that's the average manganese grades are around the 37. Then I see another question on coal over here, asking why is it more expensive to ship coal to India versus Europe? Well, so in terms of demand, I think it could add a big part of it. In terms of the absolute charters and shipping companies, we'd have to look into the specifics, but we take a look at just the raw dollar per ton costs of shipping. It could be factors to do with demand, ship availability, insurance. There are multiple factors there. As well as alternate availability. Europe also has access to lots of natural gas-fired power. Then I see there are some questions here around organized crime in the coal sector. Yeah, so this is a big problem. There have been quite a few documentaries, written pieces on this. Yes, so there are a few aspects to this. We have illegal mines, full-scale mine that is not licensed or old closed mine that gets dug up. That has an impact because that coal finds its way into ultimately the value chain. The other issue which we've seen is legitimately mined coal where they've grade swaps, low-grade coal being swapped out and instead of high-grade coal being exported, some exports have been caught out for exporting low-grade coal, as well as lower-grade coal going to Eskom that is contracted. So it is a big issue. As far as traceability goes, we have seen certain attempts. We've seen track and trace, we've seen drone technology, we've seen companies working with agents in and around Mpumalanga to try and keep track of where trucks are going, finding these illegal coal yards, but it is a difficult fight. But it is something that is being done. Then I see another question on iron ore and manganese. Devin, what's the outlook for iron ore and manganese prices for the near future? I know there is some downward pressure at the moment, but what are we seeing in the near future? And then maybe just some comments on shipping of iron ore and manganese. You know, where are main regions that we ship to for those?
Sure. In terms of the price outlook, a slightly mixed bag. Although I did see a comment on the struggling property sector in China, which is affecting steel demand at the moment, which is quite a concern. But we have seen China try to push for some in more infrastructure developments, which is supporting some demand. But um, in the beginning of this year, there has been quite a push for inventory restocking and to try build up inventories, which has supported some demand for both manganese and iron ore. But in terms of the price outlook, for manganese, we do expect this infrastructure demand to push up um, prices over the next 5 years. Although in the near term, this weakness in the property sector should hold back some of that demand, holding back some of the prices. While on the iron ore side, similar dynamics in terms of demand, where we're positive on the infrastructure side, there is significant volumes expected to come online. But iron ore margins in South Africa, particularly, are around um, the 60%, where if you look at places like Australia, you get the 70, those high EBITDA margins, so very profitable, where a lot of the producers that side, including BHP, Rio Tinto, are actually looking to, or are currently progressing with expansions of their production. So with that, we're seeing significant supply growth, pushing down on near-term prices. Whilst some of these property sector demand concerns are also weighing on sentiment.
Okay. Then there's a question here around cost of shipping coal to India. So how does Indonesia compare to South Africa? So shipping from Indonesia to India is significantly cheaper than shipping from South Africa to India for coal. South Africa to $22 or $23 per ton. Indonesia to India is about $8. So $8 instead of $23. Indonesia is much cheaper. Indonesia is much closer to India than South Africa is, so it's generally cheaper to ship from Indonesia to India. Questions around the trajectory of the price. Indonesia to India is up a little bit compared to a year and 3 months ago, but not to the extent of the South Africa to India cost. Indonesian ports haven't had the South Africa problems. So again, there are global problems like the Suez Canal, but then you get the South Africa specific problems that hurt Richards Bay, but not so much Indonesia. Then some more interesting coal questions coming through here around the Baltimore Bridge in the US, which collapsed, and impacts on the coal market. So it actually does have a slight impact on the US is a coal exporter, and while the port of Baltimore is not the main US coal export port, Hampton Roads down in Virginia is, but some coal does go through Baltimore, and that was coal to Europe. So it did put some upward pressure. We did actually see European coal prices rising a little bit in response to that bridge collapse. All right, then I see a question around green steel. Are we seeing any structural changes with that shift? I think maybe there are some iron ore shifts over there, Devin.
Sorry, in terms of shipping iron ore, any green moves, or
No, so the question is just broadly, you know, how we. So I would phrase it around how we're seeing iron ore demand as we shift towards green steel.
Sure. It should impact iron ore prices somewhat to later in the period. We do see a stronger push in Europe, where they're converting some of their blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which typically would use more scrap steel, and reduce the amount of iron ore used. So that would in turn reduce some iron ore demand as that transition happens. But we have seen that the progress has been quite slow with some of the geopolitical tension. In a lot of that green transition has taken a bit of a backseat and has been a bit slower. Over the past few years, it's still remained at around a 70% blast furnace versus 30% electric arc furnace breakdown. Yeah.
Sure. Then a question on Maputo. So the question is Maputo a stopgap for SA exports? So I would not call it a stopgap, but I do think what is interesting here is often what we see is South African, particularly coal, are not picking Maputo because they like Mozambique or they like Maputo or Matola. They're choosing it because of difficulties of getting to Richards Bay. So why are volumes through Maputo and Matola rising? Certainly, those ports and the operators are doing a great job. They're being efficient. They're raising throughput. But a big part of the problem is just South Africa is not being efficient, getting coal from Mpumalanga to Richards Bay, and then getting coal through Richards Bay. So because of South Africa's poor performance, we're seeing volumes going via Maputo. And if I can tie that to another question here around the costs of exporting coal to India, how does that compare with, how does that compare with other Mozambican ports like Nacala? So while we don't track Nacala specifically, when we look at Maputo, the cost of thermal coal, the FOB prices coming out of Maputo and the prices coming out of Richards Bay, they're broadly similar. It's worth remembering that in global shipping terms, a port like Maputo and Richards Bay are quite close together. Yes, Nacala is a little bit further north, but again, India is a great export destination for Nacala. A lot of Indian steelmakers are currently involved in coking coal production in Mozambique. Right, then I see a question around Zimbabwe to Maputo rail access. Yeah, so this is something which, again, Zimbabwe has looked into. They do want to be able to diversify, but again, it's a cost issue. Railway lines are incredibly expensive. Yeah, so it's something which Zimbabwe is absolutely looking to. Everyone wants more access to ports, but it is difficult to do. Then a question on the Chinese property market and how that's affecting their iron ore imports. Devlin, what are we seeing over there?
Sure. So the property market, as I mentioned before, has been constrained. Where the demand is coming from, it has been these the Chinese New Year in February, where China typically boosts their imports of iron ore to try to restock, so that once the holiday's over, they can resume their production. So that import demand has been what's maintained China's imports of South African iron ore, of iron ore in general.
Okay. Then we've got a question here around shipping costs to different parts of Asia. So yes, I presented on shipping costs to India, but the question is it the same cost to all parts of Asia for coal? So it's not exactly the same number, but you certainly see similar trends. So right now, shipping coal from South Africa to India is about $22 or $23 a ton. Shipping to China is more like $19 or $20 a ton, and then shipping to Japan is more like $24 or $25 a ton. So, but certainly, shipping to Asia is similar pricing, similar trends. Again, a ship doesn't have to sail only from Richards Bay to India. It can also be used to sail to places like Japan, Vietnam, China. So we do tend to see similar moves. Then Devin, an interesting one here on grades. If we have lower grades of iron ore coming out of South Africa, could that be negative, considering a shift to green steel in the future?
Yeah, I think lower grades of iron ore typically require more energy to try to produce your steel. So typically, it would have a negative impact, as that's counterintuitive to the green steel future. But that being said, for South Africa, we are not the biggest producers. So in terms of in a global aspect, the green steel industry, I think it may more affect SA demand, not so much the transition itself.
All right. So I see we do still have quite a few questions here. As far as what's happening at, excuse me. So we have one around what's happening at the current backlogs compared to historically. Are we seeing a normalization? So it's an interesting question. The end of 2023 was bad, even if you compare to historical numbers. But South African ports are generally they do have problems. It's interesting issues. So Richards Bay tended to be railway backlogged, whereas Saldanha tended to be more port side backlogged. Whereas as we got into November, December, Durban was historically bad. So the level of Durban at the end of 2023 was historically bad. Are we seeing normalization? Yes, but we are still high by historic standards. All right. Then I see the awesome questions around shipping price indices. So we actually forecast two different kinds. We forecast here at Afriforesight a container forecast index and a bulk forecast index. If you'd like more information on them, please send some emails through to either Sebastian or Marley, as well as I do see we're starting to run tight on time. For questions we haven't gotten to, we'll try to reach out. And if you do have other questions, do also please email Marley or Sebastian. Just taking a look through here. I do see there's a question around outside of the scope. Are there port backlogs in Tanzania? So that is again, yeah, not one we currently look at, but yes, similar to how all things are connected. For Central Africa, yeah, Tanzania is one of those. If it is something you'd like us to look into, please do reach out and tell us. All right. So as I said, they're coming in, and we'll try and reach out on those via email. If you do have any other questions or comments, please feel free to email Marley or Sebastian at the email addresses on screen, and we will try to reach out with the best answers when we can. I would like to thank everyone for coming out today. Thank you for your time, and please have a great day further. Thank you and goodbye.